Welcome, everyone. My name is Harmony Barker. I am the Public Programs Manager at Holocaust Museum LA, the first Holocaust museum in the United States founded by survivors. We were founded in 1961 by survivors who wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts and to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you for joining us for today's program, How We Got Here, from the Good War to the Storming of the Capitol. On January 6, 2021, Americans were shocked as they witnessed tens of thousands of self-proclaimed patriots storm the US Capitol, many proudly carrying Confederate flags. In conversation with Mel Levine, Stephen J. Ross will discuss the historical origins of post-World War II white supremacy, the groups that sprang up to resist it, and what it can tell us about that day in January. This program is presented in partnership with the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. Stephen J. Ross is the Dean's Professor of History at USC's Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and the director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. He holds degrees from Columbia University, Oxford University, and Princeton University. Dr. Ross has written extensively on working class history, social history, film history, and political history. He has received several Pulitzer Prize nominations for his work. His 2018 book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His op-ed pieces have appeared everywhere from the Wall Street Journal to the Hollywood Reporter, and his expertise on movie stars and politics has led to numerous television and documentary appearances. Mel Levine is counsel in the Century City office of Gibson, Dunn Crutcher. He served as a member of the United States Congress from 1983 to 1993, and as a member of the California Assembly from 1977 to 1982. He received his law degree cum laude from Harvard Law School, and he holds degrees from Princeton University and the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Levine was named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in California, and in 2018, the Los Angeles Business Journal listed him as one of the 500 most influential people in Los Angeles. We will have some time at the end of the program for questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please wait until the end of the program, and you can ask your question by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen J. Ross and Mel Levine. We are so honored to have you both here with us today.
Thank you, Harmony. This is Mel. I'll begin because the person who's giving us the substance is Steve, and I'm just the interlocutor here. I really appreciate your warm introduction. I wonder if Steve and I overlapped at Princeton, but I think I was there a long time before he was. I just want to say I've read one of Steve's books. I happened to grab it off the bookshelf, the Hitler in Los Angeles book that Harmony you referred to. It's a magnificent book, and particularly for people who care about the Holocaust and who are supporters of the Holocaust Museum, I would strongly encourage any of you who may not have read Hitler in Los Angeles by Stephen Ross to read it. It's eye-opening and tells you things about what was going on in Los Angeles before World War II that very few of us knew anything about, and that Steve unearthed. The title, I think, tonight was How Did We Get From There to Here? There being the greatest generation, World War II, and here being January 6th. So Steve, I invite you to walk us through that. After you do that, I'll follow up with some questions.
Thank you, Mel. What I'd like to do today is we're going to start off by me giving you some images, a little PowerPoint that you can get a sense of who these people are I'm talking about and what it looks like in the past. So I'm going to do a screen share. And all right, let me just start it here. Here we just see some quotes. The bottom line here is there is a continuum of hate that we see that takes us from the end of World War II to January 6th, 2021. And this was not the result of Donald Trump. The hate was there before Donald Trump. The hate got magnified under Donald Trump, and the hate will be there long after Donald Trump. Now, Americans, here we just have some images of the Capitol, some of the anti-Semitic images there, which are quite different from the end of World War II, this iconic photograph of the war is over, Times Square. And Americans today like to believe that the end of World War II brought a decrease in hate and a new era of tolerance in the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. Anti-Semitism and racism went up, not down, at the war's end. In 1940, for example, the Anti-Defamation League was tracking 60 organized hate groups. At the end of World War II, that had risen to 112 hate groups. And by 1946, 130 hate groups. More to the point, we have this idea that after the war, this greatest generation created a kind of kumbaya America. Nothing, again, could be further from the truth. According to 14 polls, in 1945, at the end of the war, 25% of Americans were actively anti-Semitic, 25% were opposed to anti-Semitism, and 50% said they had no fixed opinion one way or the other. And as for African Americans, a poll that same year asked, no one's going to ask, are you a racist? Head on. Instead, they asked, would you favor a law requiring employers to hire the most qualified person regardless of race? 43% of Americans said yes, they thought that was a good idea. 44% said no, they thought it was a bad idea. And 13% had no opinion. So why do we have this idea that it was a good war? Well, because it was a good war for many Americans, that many Americans went off to war and they were profoundly changed by their experience in combat. In particular, they got to know, quote, others, that is, people they never would have met in everyday life. Jews, Catholics, Protestant, Muslims, white, Black, Chicano, Puerto Rican. We are talking a whole group of people. And when you read all these histories of the platoon, it isn't that they came to love one another, but they came to respect one another. And when they came back from war, they felt that at the very least, all these veterans deserved to live a life that was free of fear and open to whatever opportunities they could afford on their own to achieve. And this also included Black troops who came back, even though they were in segregated units early on. But I read one description from an Alabama sailor who talked about how he had been a committed racist. He had never thought anything of Black people other than servile class until their boat was attacked by a Japanese fighter pilot. And he said, observing how calm and how professional the African Americans who were all in the galley proceeded to help everyone, he changed his mind about a race. He came back totally transformed. But there was another group of Americans, and this was a group talked about by John Roy Carlson, who wrote 2 books, one during the war and one after. And he points out that many Americans went to war not because they opposed Hitler and Mussolini, not because they opposed Nazism and fascism, but simply because Japan had attacked the United States. And when a foreign country attacks you, you fight back. And they return home expecting everything to be the same. Just like their northern compatriots, they believed that they were patriots, that they had fought for their war, and now they had come back expecting nothing to change. They had not gone off to change America. They went off to defend their way of life. And as they said, that way of life meant they had no problem with Blacks and Jews and minorities as long as they all knew their place. The problem is Jews and Blacks came back from war saying, we have proven our loyalty to the Republic. We now expect to be treated as first-class citizens with no prejudice at all. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, within weeks of the end of World War II, the Klan held its first big cross burning at Stone Mountain in Georgia. And the image on your right here is the modern day Klan, still burning Nazi symbols along with the cross to scare innocent Americans. Well, hate took many forms after the war. And in the book I'm writing right now, a follow-up to Hitler in LA, that's going to go from the end of the war to the 1980s. It's called The War Against Hate, American Resistance to White Supremacy After 1945. What I take a look at is 4 hate group leaders. And what we see is that these 4 hate group leaders would go from group to group to group. And as each group was foiled, they would simply pick up, start another group, and they were interacting with one another. They weren't isolated, but they were joined together as brethren in hate. And the first group I talk about is the Colombians, a group formed in Atlanta at the end of 1945, a group so extreme in its racial views that it was expelled from the Ku Klux Klan as too radical. These people wore Nazi-style uniforms, as you can see here. Many of them, like Emory Burke, the founder, were World War II veterans who came back and was disgusted at what he felt was the Yankee efforts to impose Northern liberal culture on the South. And they recruited like-minded men and women to fight along with them to protect America from the dangers of Jews and Blacks. And Blacks were the first victims of their violence. As housing was short in Atlanta, they were policing neighborhoods where Blacks were trying to move into low-income white areas. People were beaten, bombs were set off, and a whole set of munitions were collected to overthrow the government and impose a kind of racist regime on America. Those groups would be opposed by 3 groups in the after World War II, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and a group that no longer exists called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League. And it's worth pointing out that in the end of the war in 1945, the 3 men who would lead these undercover operations, all in their offices in New York, are writing memos, and each is saying the same thing. There are only 2 things we really fear in the post-war era. We know that hate had gone underground during the war and it would be revived. And here's what we fear. We can deal with any of these groups singly, but if they somehow figure out how they can communicate with one another across the nation, we are all in trouble. And the second thing they feared is that one day that some of these groups would take their crazy ideas, truly crazy racist ideas filled with hate, and bring it into one of the 2 mainstream parties, and they would embed themselves in the party and turn their hate-filled bile into government policy. Both have come true. But they would send in spies to undermine the group. In this case, Stetson Kennedy, who went undercover, gathered enough evidence, along with 2 spies sent from New York, Renee Fruchtbaum and Mario Buzzi. They gathered information and they put the Colombians out of business. The problem is, the moment the Colombians died out, one of the people who had apprenticed there, J.B. Stoner, who had been a member of the Klan, left the Klan because it wasn't radical enough. When the Colombians were crushed, he created the Stoner Christian Anti-Jewish Party, which called for the extermination of all Jews, that he said we are going to be much more modern than Hitler ever was, and that when the Jews were gone, all Christians would get their wealth and the Christian America would be really rich. African Americans would all be sent to Africa and we would have a white nation. Stoner was not some crazy guy. And I have to tell you, none of these leaders were crazy people. They were incredibly bright. Stoner would go on to get a law degree. They knew what they were doing. We move up north. This hate isn't simply confined to the South. In 1949, the National Renaissance Party, the first post-war Nazi party in America, gets formed in the Jewish capital of America, New York. And imagine it on every Friday at 86th Street between 1st and 2nd, Maydal is out there accompanied by his stormtroopers calling for death to Jews and the deportation of all African Americans. And his group, although relatively small, was important because his National Renaissance Bulletin was the social media of its day. It was sent out to places throughout the world, most particularly sent to Nazis living in Europe, living in Latin America, Australia, throughout the world, were communicating through this bulletin. Well, Maydal is eventually marginalized by the man you see in the middle here, Mana Truhill in the Nazi uniform, who is a spy for the Anti-Nazi League. But yet again, as they begin to fade out, a whole new range of violence occurs throughout the South and up the East Coast, what's called the synagogue bombings that go from 1958 to 1961. Once again, trying to put Jews in their place. And I love this quote from George Bright, a Colombian and Stoner supporter. Again, these people go from group to group to group. They acquit one of the people convicted of setting off the bombs. You can't send a man to the penitentiary for life because he's a Jew hater. Spies come in, eventually undermine them, but J.B. Stoner rises up again and forms the National States' Rights Party. And he mentor for George Lincoln Rockwell, Martin Nazi group, the American Nazi Party, Rockwell being a commander in the Navy. Stoner, Rockwell, Maydal are all working together. They travel to each other's places to help one another. Rockwell and his supporters here become famous. They have their hate bus tour. And the irony is that, Rockwell always gained attention, as they say here, by appearing in a Nazi uniform. He is eventually assassinated by one of his own, John Prattler. And the person who thought he might take over, Daniel Burris, committed suicide the day after the New York Times ran an article saying that he was in fact the son of Orthodox Jews. Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville simply mimicked Maydal's white power rallies of 1967 through the end of the 70s. They mirrored Stoner's rallies. And in fact, just to jump ahead here, he would eventually be killed. But in Unite the Right rally in August 2017, J.B. Stoner and George Lincoln Rockwell are praised by many of the groups, the Proud Boys, etc., as the godfathers of American white supremacist movements. And the point I want to make here is, I would imagine, I haven't gotten to this point in the book yet, but I would imagine you could find that a number of the leaders of the insurrection, in fact, have relatives who belonged to one of these groups. And let me stop there. And Mel.
That's quite a charming story. Let me start with your most recent reference to the Proud Boys. To what extent, Steve, do you feel that these far-right groups that participated so centrally in the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, these Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, to what extent do they have direct or indirect lineage with these lovely organizations that you've just described?
Well, as I said, I haven't gotten to that point in the research where I'm going to actually trace the leaders back, go through ancestry.com. But what I could tell you is the ideological lineage is clear, that people like David Duke have acknowledged J.B. Stoner, have acknowledged George Lincoln Rockwell. And more importantly than not, if you see these, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, as just right-wing bigots and crazy people, you're ignoring something really important, which is they see themselves as patriots. Not every one of them, obviously, but they see themselves as patriots in the same way the Columbians, J.B. Stoner's Christian Anti-Jewish Party, James Maydall, National Renaissance Party, and George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. All of them said, we are patriots. It is the white people, it is the Christians who have continually saved America. It is a Christian nation, it is a white nation that from the American Revolution on has created all the progress in our country. And what we have seen, particularly after World War II, is the attempt to impose a liberal Northern universalist view on Americans who don't want that. We are not Kumbaya America. We don't want to be surrounded by minority groups, and we certainly don't want those groups to replace us. And that, you know, that gets back to the replacement theory people were talking about at Charlottesville. The Jews will not replace us. That they also see the demographics, and they see in another 10, 20 years, whites will be a minority in this country, and they are fighting to save the nation from what they see as a very serious threat against their view of a patriotic America.
In the context of their perception of themselves as patriots, it's clear to me, and I think it's become pretty much broadly understood, that certainly the overwhelming number of people who stormed the Capitol also see themselves as patriots. They sincerely believe that the election was stolen. And they believe that some nefarious set of characters distorted the vote, and that a free and fair election would have elected Donald Trump, re-elected Donald Trump. To what extent does this self-perception of patriotism and this particular activity dovetail with the history that you're talking about?
Once again, it's a continuum. You just changed the name of the group. Here's what I would say. From 1945, the end of World War II, 45, let's say the fall of 45, through the riots, if you just keep the ideology and look at that, you're going to find the ideology is fairly constant across time. That starting with the Ku Klux Klan never talked about in 45 starting their own party. They simply were supporting Southern politicians who would support them. But with the Columbians, they wanted to start a party. They had the Columbians were going to be a political party. And what they said is within the next year, we are going to capture the mayoral office of Atlanta. Within a year to two, we will capture the governorship of Georgia. And then within a short period after that, we will capture the American presidency. They go down in flames. J.B. Stoner says, you guys weren't militant enough. And he offers, again, that very appealing idea that if you expel Jews or exterminate them, in either case, Jews will not take their money with them. And all that money is going to be distributed to Christians. And then we're going to have a white nation that made this nation. Jews did not make America. Blacks did not make America. It was white Christians. Stoner goes down, the National Renaissance Party pops up, and they run somebody for Congress at one point, but they never get enough supporters to make it serious. But J.B. Stoner pops up again in the 60s to start the National States Rights Party that in fact has a great influence on the Dixiecrats and a great influence in the South, even though as a party it never really takes off. And after that, you don't have any serious attempts at new political parties that are talking about winning through elections, whether it's local, state, or national. Instead, what you get are certain groups that start aligning with political parties. And what we've seen is not until the last 4 years do you have those political parties welcoming in those supporters. I just remember when Ronald Reagan was running for president, actually when he was running for governor and then again for president, he was being supported by the John Birch Society. And he was asked, what do you feel about the Birchers supporting you? And he says, look, I'm not asking for their support, but if they want to support me, that's their business. And that's what I would say we see with the Republicans today. They're not necessarily going out and cultivating that vote, but if those people want to come in to their party, so be it. They simply come in as Republicans.
Well, that's exactly what's happening. You indicate that this preceded Donald Trump and will follow Donald Trump, and it wasn't Trump per se, but unquestionably, Trump has encouraged support from bigots and anti-Semites. So to what extent has that encouragement strengthened the reach of the people that you appropriately call haters?
Well, what I'm saying is it's not Donald Trump because Trump is gone, and yet look what's happened to the Republican Party. The party that can allow Marjorie Taylor Greene to be a serious person in its party, and we can go through another set of names, but a party that is many of its members, they've just thrown out their number 3 person in leadership. Of all people, Liz Cheney. I never thought I'd ever be defending Liz Cheney, but I have to say, well, we certainly disagree on policy. I give her tremendous amount for her courage in standing up to her party and saying, we are the party of lies. You can't have a political party that is the party of lies. And this is precisely what the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Nazi League were talking about in 1945, that some of the most radical right-wing hate-filled ideas will make their way into a mainstream party. And instead of seeming to be radical hate-filled ideas, they will become part of a party platform for either Democrats or Republicans. They weren't sure which party would adopt that, but what we've seen, it's come true. So as long as the Republican Party as a party refuses to acknowledge truth, how are we going to, even with Donald Trump gone, this is going to continue. Why would we think it will stop?
Well, he's gone, but he's not gone. And he is the prime progenitor of the ultimate falsehood, the big lie, which he repeats several times a week. So the most aggressive purveyor of precisely the message that causes those who storm the Capitol to believe they're patriots is being promulgated by Donald Trump.
Just remember, and I know some maybe conservative viewers are going to get upset with this, but Joseph Goebbels was the one who said back in 1933, if you tell a big lie enough and repeat it over and over and over again, people will begin to believe it. The bigger the lie, the more preposterous it is, the more likely they are to believe it if you can keep saying it over and over with conviction. And that's what we see. This was not a stolen election. There is not a single shred of legitimate evidence from either side to show that, in fact, the election was stolen. The fact that we have to even talk about this in a democracy makes me crazy. But that's why I say until the Republican Party rejects this. It's no longer Donald Trump. You know, it's the Trump party. And, you know, what I've been reading is there's a certain cynicism, which the Trump supporters are easier to mobilize than any base they've ever had before. And so let's just keep mobilizing it and winning office.
Let me walk you back a little further in time. We started this from World War II, but how far back in time does this go? What's the extent of the roots of this in and around the Civil War, for example? Is there a continuum from the 1860s through today?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think what I would say is the American nation has never reckoned with its racist past. And we've had 3 moments when that is possible. Right after the Civil War, right after World War II, and today. And after the Civil War, the group known as the Radical Republicans, which was Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, basically said, you know, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, but they argued that political freedom without economic freedom is not true freedom at all. And what they suggested, which I think we could learn a lot, they said, look, race relations are so frazzled in the South. You can't expect whites and blacks to love one another. Particularly, you're not to expect whites to love blacks. But if they are of the same class, they will come to respect one another. And if you respect one another, you're not going to be having the same level of violence. And their answer was they were going to remake the Southern class society. They were going to seize the land of the Confederate leaders, not you know, those who fought other than the generals. Generals had all taken an oath to the Union, including Robert E. Lee, who is, to my mind, a traitor to the United States. He took an oath at West Point to serve his nation, and then he betrayed his nation. They were going to seize the land from Jefferson Davis and from the leadership, and they were going to take all the land the federal government had, and they were going to turn it over either in the 40 acres and a mule or the Homestead Act, which was 160 acres. And if you farmed it for 5 years, it became yours. And the idea was, if we redistribute this land, and most of it will go to whites, not blacks, but poor white farmers. And your audience needs to know that during the Civil War, at the beginning of the war, only 1/4 of the Southerners owned slaves. So 3/4 of those fighting were fighting to preserve the slaves for 1/4. Well, the Radical Republicans said no. If we redistribute the land and create a black and white middle class, it will totally transform the South. It will transform race relations, and it will make for a more harmonious. Again, you don't have to love your neighbor, but you want to let your neighbor live in peace. And if your neighbor succeeds through hard work, more power to your neighbor. We had the same opportunity after World War II, but we never really confronted racism. We didn't confront it then, in part because so many members of the government were, in fact, also, particularly on the House Un-American Activities Committee, were either Klan members or Klan supporters. J. Edgar Hoover, who could have done something with the FBI, was both an anti-Semite and a racist. That, as far as he was concerned, the real problem in America were communists. And he was surveilling communists throughout his period of head of the FBI and ignoring threats to blacks and Jews. And so blacks and Jews could never even count on the American government. And we are now, I just read today that Representative McCarthy is refusing to support a panel that is going to look at the causes of the riots, claiming that it will not look at left-wing violence, only going to look at right-wing violence. So yet again, we will not have a reckoning. And here's what I would tell you. We could learn a lot from Germany. At least Germany has had a reckoning with what they did after World War II. We have never had a reckoning in our country, none at all.
My mind is racing to about 5 different topics that you've touched upon here. In your book, Hitler in Los Angeles, you outline any number of instances where senior members of our government, when they were urged to look into Nazi infiltration, were much more concerned about finding communists than they were about finding Nazis, even though we were about to be and actually fighting Adolf Hitler. And I gather that that is a recurrent theme.
Yeah, it was recurrent here in the police department when Leon Lewis, who's the hero of my book, The Spy Master, within a few months of launching an undercover operation to penetrate the German-American Bund, which was then called the Friends of New Germany, his 4 spies discovered that there's a plot to seize the armories in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. And Lewis, who figured, I'm going to just run this spy operation until I get, he's a lawyer. So he says, until I can get unimpeachable evidence that I can submit in a court. I will then, once I get that, I will turn it over to the authorities and let them do this because that's their job, not mine. And so he goes to visit Police Chief Davis, James Davis, and 2 minutes into his meeting with Davis, Davis tells him, stop, you don't get it. That the Hitler is only doing what he has to do to save the German people. And that in fact, the real threat to Los Angeles is not coming from the Nazis and the fascists, it's coming from all those communists in Boyle Heights, which was the Jewish neighborhood. And basically he told Lewis that as far as he was concerned, every commie was a Jew and every Jew was a commie. And when Lewis then went to the sheriff, he got the same brush off because the sheriff, Eugene Biscaluse, happened to be really good friends with the German Nazi Counsel in LA, George Gissling. He then went to the FBI, and the local bureau here was very sympathetic, but they said, we can't launch any investigation unless it's approved by Washington and J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover, even as late as 1940, when the LA office said, we absolutely need to put Hermann Schwinn, the head of the Nazi group in LA, and also the head of all Nazi organizations on the West Coast, and the #2 Nazi in America, we need to put him under surveillance. And Hoover writes back, Schwinn has broken no law, therefore you can't put him under surveillance. But in the meantime, he had his FBI office tailing radicals in Hollywood, people like Charlie Chaplin, a socialist writer Upton Sinclair, and a whole bunch of others who were either Jews, communists, or communists and alleged communists and Jews. And so Leon Lewis, Jews, minorities were left to themselves during the war to just figure it out on their own. And nothing changed after the war. That these 3 Jewish groups that continue spying through the 80s said we can't rely on the American government, and we certainly can't rely on the FBI. And in fact, I found memos from the Atlanta office in the 50s where they refer to what they called the Anti-Defamation League without any, and it wasn't a typo. They thought it was funny to call them that.
How is it that the white supremacists, as it were, historically link Jews and blacks?
Because there are others. And also remember, the Jewish-Black coalition really begins in the 1930s in a strong way during the Great Depression. And that coalition goes on for years out of 2 driving principles. One, a kind of Jewish liberalism, tikkun olam, heal the world. Don't make it a world filled with hate. Make it a world filled with at least tolerance. And the second thing Jewish leaders talk about is we're not naive. There's self-interest here too, because when they go after the blacks, they're going to go after the Jews next. And we don't want that to happen. So it is in our self-interest as well as altruistic to form an alliance. And that alliance stays pretty active through the 60s and 70s.
And then?
It begins to fray with, in the late 60s, with the Black nationalist movement, with Elijah Muhammad, with Malcolm X. and suddenly the Jews become just another white devil, the same as there's no difference between the Jews and other white people. Even though for many hate groups, Jews are still not white. Even to this day, Jews are not white.
Historically, and at least in terms of my own lifetime, my own formative political years, Martin Luther King and the most prominent Black civil rights leaders were allied very closely with Jewish leaders. Jews marched with Blacks in the 60s. What is your view of how that evolved and where it went?
Well, how it devolved is the better way to put it. How it devolved is people began missing the big picture. And the big picture is minority groups need to support one another. And it doesn't matter whether it's Jews, Blacks, Muslims. And I want to remind people for hundreds of years, Catholics were a reviled minority, that we had religious civil wars in America in the 1840s and 50s, literally civil wars breaking out in places like Cincinnati, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, of Catholic versus Protestants in the cities here. And through the civil rights movement, again, there, at some point, leadership forgot that any minority rising up is going to help any other minority rising up. One minority turning against another minority is only going to hurt the cause of all minorities. And we've seen that, I would argue, from the late 60s through today, that there has been an amnesia about this Jewish-Black alliance, that for years, Jews were, in many ways, the closest allies the Black community has, but that has gotten forgotten over time.
Where do you think that stands now with regard to the Jewish organizations that you identified in the 60s and their relationships with the Black community today?
It's frayed. It's frayed very deeply. And, you know, we've seen, and also in part because of splits about Israel, splits about Zionism, splits about, you know, is Israel the Netanyahu government, or is that something different? Splits about treatment of Palestinians. How many hours do we have to talk about this?
Well, actually, I see it's 4:45, and I recall that Harmony thought we should open it up to Q&A at that point. I don't see any questions on my Q&A screen. I don't know if that means there aren't any, but let's see if the audience has some questions. We're in what should be the question period, and I shouldn't be monopolizing the entire ability to ask questions. Harmony, do we have questions from the audience?
Okay, I'll just jump in. We don't have any questions yet, but for our viewers, if you would like to ask a question, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can click on that and type your question there, and we will be able to see that, and we would love to address your question. Great, here we have our first question. Mel, do you see that?
I see part of it. Hold on, and I would, yeah. Janet asks, which Jewish organizations should we support most today? ADL, question mark.
Well, the ADL has been the longest active of the groups I've looked at. The ADL is still the kind of big dog, and the ADL is still monitoring hate groups throughout the country. And I've been giving talks to ADL groups after Hitler in LA, and I met with Jonathan Greenblatt at one of them and said to him, I would actually go across the country talking to ADL groups for no charge, just pay my expenses, but I do have one favor. which is I want to go into your spy records and take a look at what was going on in the 40s through the 80s. And he said, no, you can't do that because we're still spying and still using some of the same techniques as we did in the post-war era. So the ADL is still monitoring the Southern poverty group. But for Jewish groups, I'd say the ADL is still the group we should be supporting.
Avia says, this is sad and known to me. I don't know why more of this is taught, I think he means isn't taught in schools.
It isn't taught in schools in part because my generation is responsible. That those of us who grew up in the era of civil rights in the Vietnam War, and my generation of historians simply said, well, Germany lost the war, so Nazism and fascism was never a serious threat. But the serious threat, according to American political leaders, was communism. So most of us for years wrote about communism and anti-communism and that kind of fight. And we ignored the long legacy of fascism and Nazism and white supremacy in America. And it's only now being written. And so it's going to take, when historians like myself are doing it, it takes a while until it's going to filter into the history books. It's not going to be until another 10 years or so till we begin to get a difference in history books talking about our fascist Nazi past.
Lois asks, what of the extreme leftist groups, Antifa and such?
Well, there are extreme groups on the left, but what we've seen is the violence. While there have been incidents of violence, it tends to be blown out of proportion, so that you might have 10 incidents of racist violence or violence against Blacks, and then you have an Antifa group, and then it is seen as an equivalent. It is not an equivalent. You don't have a hard left group, a history of hard left groups that are, in fact, violent left groups in this country. Not in the same way you do of right-wing groups that have a very long history. And the biggest one would be go back to the Ku Klux Klan after after the Civil War. I mean, you can find other hate groups early on, the nativists, but hate really blossoms after the Civil War. And it's hate on the right. Not to say that there's never hate on the left, but it's hate on the right.
Janet says, you mentioned the Southern Poverty Center. I have heard that there is controversy over them. Can you summarize what they have done that is anti-Jewish or what they are doing that makes them anti-Jewish?
No, I really don't know enough about that controversy to comment.
Jack asks, does the prominence of Bernie Sanders, both Jewish and socialist, represent a turning of the page in US attitudes towards both, or is he just an aberration beginning nothing much?
Well, I'm not really sure because part of the question is a little bit ambiguous, Jack. Are we talking about, does the prominence of Bernie as a Jew? Because I don't think people see him as so much as a Jew, but they do see him as a socialist. Does it represent a turning point on the page? I don't know if he's an aberration, but he's not, he's certainly not mainstream yet. Although I think what we see is the Democratic Party is slowly moving increasingly to the left.
An anonymous attendee asks, do you think that Trump did give these people the okay to show their racism in public once again?
Yes. I think, you can find Trump's quotes denouncing every one of these groups, and his supporters will pull those quotes out. But take a look at the dates those quotes are made. He doesn't denounce them immediately. He only denounces them when there's a lot of blowback on him to do so. And what I would say is when hate is allowed to fester and not denounced, there's a real problem. And hate is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. It's not a left or right issue. We are Americans. And what I find interesting in both the first book, my book, Hitler in LA, and the new book, The War Against Hate, the overwhelming number of undercover operatives, and I mean, oh, I've never done the actual numbers, but I'm going to guess it's 95% or so, are Christian. And they are working for Jewish groups, but they never once see themselves as working for the Jews. They are working for America. Because what these people believe is if you are an American and you see a group coming in and threatening other Americans because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity, their birthplace, that doesn't work in America. And it's the obligation of every true American citizen to protect other citizens against that kind of a harm. And so they felt they were working as true patriots for America. And it just happened to be the Jews were in charge of that organization. But here were people putting their lives at risk. And in the case of Hitler in LA, Leon Lewis, 3 of his spies die. The Nazis say, we're going to kill you. If we discover who you are, we are going to kill you. And 3 of them die. And so these are people who have put their lives at risk for others. And what they see is when the police refuse to act, when the sheriff's department refused to act, when the FBI refuses to act, what are you going to do? And more to the point, when a president refuses to condemn hate groups, it really does start at Charlottesville. All these groups were there before. And even if it had been Hillary as president and not Donald Trump, those groups would still be with us. They just wouldn't be as prominent because nobody in the Republican or Democratic leadership was going to acknowledge their right to protest in the way they are protesting, to attack Jews, to attack Blacks, to attack Muslims, to attack immigrants. That doesn't work in America. It just doesn't work, or at least it didn't work until 2016.
Rachel asks, being a child of a Holocaust survivor and a retired high school teacher, I had difficulty in discussing discrimination against Jews with Black and Latino students who saw me as just another white lady. Do you have any suggestions on how to address this issue?
Yeah, the first thing I would do is ask your students, okay, what color am I? And they're going to laugh. They're going to say, what kind of question is that? I say, well, what color am I? Say, white. They're going to say white. And you say, well, if you asked somebody in America, a good Christian in 1920, what do you think they would be likely to say? And they're not going to know. And the answer is not white. That Jews were not considered white for a very long time. Amongst each other, they did, but they were called Asiatics. They were called simply non-white. And in many ways, it wouldn't be until after the war, at least the Great Depression after World War II, that Jews did enter the American, quote, melting pot, salad bowl, whatever you want to call it. And that what I would talk to the students about is who are the allies of minorities as they've been persecuted across time? Who allies with whom and who persecutes whom? And just explain this is not a history that is known. It's not a history that is told very often. And here's what the history is and try to explain it.
An anonymous attendee asks, do you feel Trump fueled this more than any other US president?
Yes.
Janet asks, what do you know about the group Integrity for America First?
I don't know anything about that group. I don't know if they're right, left, or center. By the way, one thing to understand is the more patriotic the name of the group, the more likely they are to be right-wing. When you look at these groups in the 30s, 40s, 50s, they are either the American this or the Christian this. They all want to cling to the Americanism, America first, American nationalists, the Christian Patriot Party, the Christian Nationalist Party. Those who have hyper nationalism tend to be the most reactionary right-wing hate groups in America.
Do you think it was a coincidence that Donald Trump chose America First, or did he know the history?
You know what? I couldn't begin to tell you that. I'm sure he loved the name because it sounds right. And I could see if I knew nothing and knowing Trump's politics, America ahead of everyone. We've been the suckers for the world. The world has made better deals on everything, and I'm going to come in and make the new good deals. And it's going to be America first. Whether he knew the incredibly anti-Semitic, racist past of America first, I don't know.
I've wondered that. Okay, we've got 3 more minutes and 2 questions. So we'll make these the 2 final questions. Another anonymous attendee, do you feel this is important to teach in schools? As a younger viewer, the majority of students do not know anything about this. What are your views on this?
Well, I think it is, and it is being taught in school. And now there's a group facing history, facing ourselves that I've spoken to some of at their training orientation. And these are great people in great groups. These are teachers who are going in over the summer during breaks on their own. They're not getting paid for this. And they are getting lessons basically in hate groups and the opposition to hate groups throughout American history. And they are the ones who are going to be coming into the classrooms until we can get a deep, well, it's going to take a long time, because what we see is, what is American history? Should we be teaching this whole thing right now with the ethnic studies curriculum? Whose history do we teach? The whole attempt at Donald Trump to create a new history commission to, not talk about all these minority leaders, but talk about great white people of America. And here's what I would say. There have been many great white people in America, and there have been many great people of different religions, different colors. A great person is a great person. And what we've done is ignored half of our, well, it's not quite half our population, but we ignored a large percentage of our population, people who have quite literally built America and who have been written out of its history. And it's time to write them back into the history, and trying to write white supremacy for what it is, a hate-filled aspect of American history that has been with us for over 200 years and needs to be contained. You're never going to get rid of hate. You can't legislate against hate, but you can make it uncomfortable for haters.
The last question from Charles is, how do you respond to Trump supporters who boast about his support for Israel?
Well, that gets very controversial. You can see articles in the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg and Bret Stephens arguing opposite sides of that. What I would simply today, I would simply say, and for those of you paying attention here, Mel is running. Is it tomorrow night, Mel?
It is tomorrow night, yeah.
The two of them are going to be in dialogue with one another. I would, now what was the question? I veered off here.
It just left the screen, but I think basically it was, how do you respond about Trump supporters touting Trump's support for Israel?
Right, so some of the argument is Trump has been the most pro-Israel president we've ever had. What I would say is Trump has been the most pro-Netanyahu president ever. And Trump has supported right-wing policies in Israel that in some ways mirror his right-wing policies in America. And what I would say, and this is such a controversial issue, what I would say is I think Trump has actually weakened Israel. He's weakened Israel's status in the world. He's not confronted Israel about issues it needs to confront itself about. And I am not in any way saying that it is okay for Palestinians to be firing rockets into Israel. In the same way, it's not okay for Israel to be taking such drastic action, but there's been no attempt to kind of reach a middle here. And when you have a right-wing president supporting a right-wing leadership, if what you believe is in a right-wing Israel, then yes, Trump has been a great president. If what you believe in is a more democratic Israel, Trump has undermined Israel's status in the world and its own national integrity. And I would argue it's undermined its own security issues.
Well, I think this has been a really illuminating, if not depressing, but nevertheless illuminating hour. Stephen, thank you very, very much. I envy these kids who are taking your classes. I think it's, you're an inspiration, and I think that they're very fortunate, and so were we in the past hour. Harmony, I send it back to you.
I want to make one comment before, Harmony, you end it, which is, this isn't depressing. My colleagues are saying, how can you keep writing about Nazis and fascists and right-wing haters? And the argument goes back to some of the questions. I want this in the school curriculum. I am empowered by doing this. I want to uncover this history and get it out so that we understand it. This isn't just a moment. This has been going on for 200 years. And unless we know the history and confront our history, it's going to keep going. So for me, it's inspiring. It's difficult, but it's inspiring material. To really understand what America is to understand the whole sweep of America, not simply one side of it.
Fair point. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Mel, for a really fascinating conversation and history lesson. That this is exactly why we have these programs, so that we can share this history more widely with our audience and hopefully, create a more informed and empathetic populace. So on behalf of the Holocaust Museum LA, I want to thank you both for sharing your expertise and your insights with us. To our viewers, I just want to note that if you are interested in purchasing Hitler in Los Angeles or in learning more about the work of Facing History, I have dropped both of those links in the chat, so you should be able to follow those and get more information if you are interested. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us this Thursday at 11 a.m. for our weekly Holocaust Survivor Talk, featuring survivor Mike Wolf, who escaped to Great Britain as part of the Kinder Transport. You can also join us again on Thursday at 4 p.m. for a special Jewish American History Month edition of our monthly series, Inside the Acid-Free Box, American Jewish Liberators of World War II. You can join 2 members of our museum team as they dive into our archives and collections and explore some of the materials donated to us by Jewish service members in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. You can also find more information about all of our virtual events on our website at holocaustmuseumla.org. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you are enjoying our program, please consider supporting our work by going to holocaustmuseumla.org to make a donation. Thank you again to Stephen Ross and Mel Levine for joining us today, to the Kasdan Institute for its partnership in this program, and to all of you for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you in person someday soon.